Dear colleagues and friends, welcome to today's event, which is part of the SNF Centre for Hellenic Studies annual spring seminar series. Before we begin with today's proceedings, let us respectfully acknowledge that we're holding this event on SFU's Burnaby campus on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Kwikwetlem, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. Now, our speaker today is Dr. Panayiotis Pappas, who received his doctoral degree in linguistics from the Ohio State University before he joined SFU's linguistics department, where he's currently chair. I should note that aside from his linguistics affiliation, Dr. Pappas was one of the pioneers in what was then a very small Hellenic studies program, and especially since at the SNF Centre for Hellenic Studies, we still are very much committed to online pedagogy and knowledge translation. It is important to point out that all these initiatives began very much with him in these early days of the Hellenic Studies program. What became the Odysseus online Greek language tutor started with him, and it is on that base that later initiatives such as the current Stavros have developed. Now, Dr. Pappas's range is focused on Greek language, and which is the central focus of his research, ranging from language variation and change, sociolinguistic, statistical methods, and historical linguistics, Greek and Greek in BC. Today's talk is titled Dialect Diversity in the Greek of Greek Canadians, and I will not talk anymore. I will pass it on to him.
Thank you, Dimitri, for the gracious introduction, and I'm very proud about the Stavros Niarchos Foundation program at Hellenic Studies and the work that you guys have done over the last decade, when I moved more with linguistics and concentrated my efforts there. And congratulations to you guys on how well you have grown the online course offerings and all that great work. And there actually, we should say that there's another place where there's convergence between Hellenic studies and linguistics, because the basis for Greek also became a basis for indigenous languages learning platforms, and that's a really great way to see the work spreading and helping other communities as well. And in some major ways, the work that I will present today has to do with language maintenance, because I'll be looking at the second wave of immigration of Greeks to Canada. It won't be a very linguistic-y talk, but if you want to ask me linguistic-y questions, you may. I will mostly be talking about who these people are and presenting a bit of a sociolinguistic profile. Then I will talk a little bit about the dialect diversity that we find among these speakers. I would like to acknowledge the fact that we live and work on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people. I would like to acknowledge the generous contribution of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, which gave the money to collect the data that we collected for this project. The help of the Canadian Consulate in Athens with getting this started, and our participants from British Columbia and Victoria all the way to Halifax for contributing in many ways. We were a big team that was assembled essentially by Professor Angela Raleigh at the University of Patras and Professor Anastassiadis at McGill, and then Psychis Gekas from York and I were in charge of data collection in our areas. Of course, Tassos did a lot of data collection in Montreal and Quebec. I want to mention Simos, Dr. Simon Fraser, who did much of the work of the data collection in Vancouver and accompanied me on several trips in other cities in Western Canada. Dr. Dimitris Papazachariou, which has been helping me a lot with the phonetic and phonological analysis of the data, and our own and present Lawrence Bosman, who recently graduated from SFU and was really a huge part of us being able to apply some computational methods to our database with some pretty interesting results, which I hope I have time to quickly show you at the end of this presentation. So I'll give you a brief description of the Immigrec project, then I'll give you vignettes to try to sketch out the sociolinguistic profile of 53 speakers in Western Canada. And then I'll talk about common modern Greek by describing its features and how they are present in the language of our participants. And I'll describe the variation by looking in a bit more detail about the how the unstressed syllabic augment is used in their language, and conclude with some thoughts about what language are our speakers speaking. So the Immigrec project was conceived as an interdisciplinary project, which aims to document the second wave of Greek immigration to Canada. So that roughly that's the period from 1945 to 1975. And from the very beginning, we wanted to collect oral histories and archival material. And we wanted to understand the communities established all across Canada, not simply from a linguistic perspective, but from a perspective that brought all of our expertise, all the different fields of expertise together. So Tassos and Sekis are historians, Angeliki and I are linguists, but on our teams we had anthropologists, sociologists, and so everybody contributed to the ideas of what we wanted to look for. The end result was a database to which 448 participants contributed, and they contributed in different ways. Most of them gave us an interview. Many of them gave us an interview and provided us with archival material, picture books, immigration paperwork, some really neat pamphlets, or like the menus from the ships that they had to come over. And all of this is in our portal, which is immigrec.com if you're interested to look at it. We, as I said, covered many areas in Canada, mostly Victoria, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Regina, Winnipeg, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and the areas around there. But we even had a few interviews from Halifax. And it turns out that we managed to represent 13 of the 15 Greek dialect areas through 300 hours of recorded interviews. All these materials have been uploaded, cataloged, and described on a cloud-based database where the consortium of researchers, all of us have access to the same items. And so it really helps us produce a lot of interdisciplinary work. And the interviews are based on a common questionnaire. It's not a strict questionnaire, meaning speakers had the ability to go off on their own topics or things that they were interested in. But in terms of demographic information, linguistic information, we asked the same questions of everyone and got answers that can be quickly collected and analyzed. For Angeliki and me, the main objective was to examine aspects and patterns of language contact, mostly between Greek and English, because most of the Greek immigrants ended up adopting English as their second language and not French, but there is some contact between Greek and French. And then issues of dialectal variation among our speakers. And I will focus on this second topic today. Okay, so individual Greeks started arriving to Canada from the early 1800s onward, but as Vlasi's 1952 documents, These were mostly accidental immigrations rather than any part of a big settlement plan. But then in 1891, the current crop in the Peloponnese failed. That was the first time that Greeks settled to North America, including Canada, as part of a organized settlement plan. The same source notes that by 1921 there were roughly 6,000 Greeks in Canada, and by 1941 there was almost 12,000. But more than half of these had been born in Canada. So you can see that immigration to Canada from Greece up until World War II began to slow down, right? And the people who come from Greece were being replaced by people who were born in Canada. However, according to Tzitzilis, the next major study of Greek Canadians, the pattern was completely reversed in the 1950s. From 1950 to 1975, more than 120,000 new immigrants arrived from Greece, settling mostly in Toronto and Montreal. The reasons for this massive influx were the breakdown of the Greek economy and civil society, which was caused by World War II, the civil war that immediately followed until 1948, and then the long period of persecution of leftist and left-leaning citizens in different areas of Greece, especially in rural areas. Like in rural areas, all three plagues had fallen. Like the World War II had done the great damage. Then the Civil War was fought mostly in the rural areas after brief skirmishes in 1945. And then, of course, there were people in rural areas, had a choice between immigrating to the city or immigrating to a city outside of Greece, and a lot of them ended up choosing doing that after trying to move to the city a little bit. For a little while, this persecution intensified in 1967 after it had abated a little bit, because 1967 is the year of the coup in Greece. The coup lasted 7 years, and many people left, especially in those early years. And many of these people, because there were political motivations, came to Canada because Canada was more accepting of leftist and left-leaning citizens than the US was, right? So whereas the major destination of Greek immigration before World War II is the US, after World War II, it's mostly Canada and Australia. The restoration of democracy in 1974 stopped this major routes of migration. And then after Greece joined the European Economic Community in 1981, people could move much more easily to European countries. So those who wanted to immigrated there rather than making their way to the US, Canada, or Australia. However, a new wave of economic emigration was created by the global financial crisis of 2008, which came to a head in Greece around 2011, 2012, and then over the next 5 years after that, it's estimated that over 400,000 Greeks immigrated, but mostly to other member countries of the European Union. According to the 2016 census, there were 2,000 immigrants who were born in Greece, sort of a typo there. But this doesn't tell us how many Greek Canadians who had moved to Greece as young people, once Greece was in the economic straits, came back to Canada. From anecdotally, I would say 8 out of the 10 people that I know who immigrated to Canada from Greece during those years, one of them had a Canadian passport. Like usually it's like a family, even with a teenage age kid, that are coming back to Canada because there are no longer opportunities in Greece. So what I hope to have shown in this brief overview of Greek immigration to Canada is that the communities that we're talking about today were built by immigrants in the 1920s and 1930s, but they've been populated by people who immigrated to Canada in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, and now they are really who we see here is mostly the third generation descendants of that second wave of immigration, and to a much lesser extent, people who immigrated to Canada after 2010. So when we look at these communities and the ones that were established after the second wave, the majority of these people immigrated for economic reasons, and then to a lesser extent through personal connections. Most of them just have primary education, which I mean a few years of elementary school. By secondary education, I mean maybe a couple of years of high school. And so when I say higher education, I really mean like being educated past the age of 14 or 15. Because that's what the Greek system was like back then. Most of them come from the Peloponnese, of around 40%, and then to the lesser degree, the Ionian Islands and Crete. But all major areas of Greece are represented, as are areas from the Greek diaspora, notably Cyprus, Egypt, the city of Alexandria, and other Commonwealth territories like South Africa, let's say. But most of them had very little knowledge of Canada or its official languages when they arrived. So that's a picture that we get when we look at our data on the entire database. But now I want to focus more a little bit on these 53 interviews that we were able to qualitatively analyze from Western Canada in a paper that I'm writing with Anastassiadis from University of Alberta. We look at these speakers, we'll see that they arrived in Canada at quite a young age. The mean overall is around 21 years. And they weren't really older than, well, we had very few speakers that were over 30, but most of them were maximum 25 years old when they moved to Canada. As in the general database, the reasons for immigration were either the economic situation in Greece or political persecution. And one aspect that was quite surprising was marriage. They came to be married. So what would happen in those cases was that the sons and daughters, but mostly the daughters of the first wave of immigrants, could not find suitable grooms or brides in their small communities. So they would get in touch with relatives back in Greece and try to arrange a marriage. And as you can see, most of it happened over correspondence. People would write to each other. If they were, they would send one photograph or maybe two. And you can see here, Thomai, all these are pseudonyms, of course. This remembers it as a production where she tried to look older because she was actually quite young when they were arranging this marriage. And it was actually quite common talking to the men saying like, I came here to be married. In terms of employment, the Trudgill study provides detailed statistics about the occupational status of the second wave Greek immigrants, and they show that the vast majority of them entered the country as unskilled laborers, and we found the same thing in our interviews. A lot of it was to be employed in Greek restaurants or in mining camps as cooks, but many times also just as dishwashers. This was complicated because in addition to not having any education, they also did not know English or French. Even if they weren't working in restaurants, they would seek out jobs where they could have a Greek connection. So you see here how he talks about going to the factory because the foreman there was Greek, and they could actually make arrangements to find work. So it's important here to note, as we're building this sociolinguistic profile, that the monolinguistic status of the immigrants played this two-way role in terms of their further integration in Canadian society. It led them to work environments where Greek was at least a functional way of communication communication, and by doing so kept them closely connected with their ethnic community and strengthened their language maintenance, but also brought them in contact with other varieties of Greek. The next aspect is way of life, and what comes out of our interviews is that there were three pillars around which they tried to construct their way of life. It was language, community, and religion. Other researchers, such as Tzitzilis, but also Gavaki 1974, noticed the endogamous nature of the families that made up the Greek communities in the second wave of immigration. But it was also true of the first wave as well. But it wasn't always like that. For example, the first Greeks that immigrated to Canada in the mid 1800s, there weren't other Greeks for them to marry. So there's actually a very famous historical figure of the Greek community in Victoria who was married to an indigenous woman there. In Tzitzilis 1971 is a study which looked at the attitudes of Greek immigrants who lived in Thunder Bay in Ontario. He specifically asked them who would they like their children to marry, and the response there was that they had to marry other Greeks, not necessarily other Orthodox believers, Christian Orthodox believers, but Greeks especially. So this just really shows you what the emphasis is on Greek identity for members of this community. There are exceptions, though, and we should talk about these as well. There were many people, especially people who were moving from Commonwealth countries, would come, they would know the language, English, and they would also have had some kind of more formal education. So, for example, in our interviews, there were many people who were accountants or anyway, worked like in the, what we call today, the HR aspects of big factories in Alexandria or Cyprus. And as they were seeing the situation evolving there, they moved to Canada and they were able to these types of jobs. But there were also people who were well educated in Greece who made the move to Canada. As in this case, we see somebody who was a civil engineer, and his wife was able to work as a public school teacher. And so they had a much more open network. But it's interesting that it was important for them to say in the interview that they were still very well connected to the Greek community. The next issue is the issue of language learning. How do these people go about maintaining Greek? They did it in a way that's quite remarkable in terms of how much effort and money and time they dedicated to it, especially when you consider the fact that these people were not formally educated in Greece. They established schools all over the place. In big cities like Toronto and Montreal, these schools were actually quite thriving until the third generation. And in some cases, they even managed to get Greek on the electives curriculum of their province. That was true in Alberta. And this is a very telling quote for me because it shows a couple of things. Number one, the amount of pride and passion that this person has about the effort and the success that she sees it. And then also the sensitivity of the issues to what the next generation is doing, right? Where she says, but today, although I don't want to offend anyone, and then she tries to talk about how basically her children did not do as good of a job at transmitting the Greek language to their kids. In her opinion, right? I'm not necessarily agreeing with this, but it's important that this is the perception. That kind of made us wonder, like, so why was the first generation so successful in their eyes, and then there's a very different situation with the second generation? And we found this this trope that came up in several interviews, which we called, they called it actually the Great Joke. And the Great Joke was everybody came here thinking that they were not going to settle. They were just economic immigrants. They were going to work here for at least 5 years, maximum 10, and then they would take their earnings and go back to Greece and be able to start anew there, right? So what comes out of their interviews is that it was super important that the kids know really good Greek so that when they return to Greece as 10-year-olds or 12-year-olds, they wouldn't have a problem entering the Greek school system. And so that was a very big motivation for them. And so it makes sense that the next generation, which then sees itself as established in Canada and doesn't have this motivation of, well, at some point we're going to go back to Greece, then the drive to keep the Greek speaking as high a priority in the family, especially when they also have moved from an sort of monogamous family constitution to being more accepting of marrying with maybe the same Christian Orthodox faith, but from different ethnic communities or even non-Christian communities. You can see how that then begins to complicate the way of transmitting the language to the next generation. However, overall, we mostly talked to people who were really proud that they came from Greece and really wanted to go back to Greece. We talked to 75-year-olds who were hoping that just a couple more years and they'll be able to go back to Greece. And some of them were realistic and saying, yeah, now my kids are here now, and what kind of healthcare would I have in Greece, and would I get subsidies from a medicine and so forth. So they were realistic, but they still had that dream. Which again, if you think that most of them came from Greece almost feeling like they were run out of the country, is quite an interesting thing. And overall, we saw an attitude in which they displayed a hybrid identity, as you can see here. Some of them felt mostly Greek, but also quite a bit Canadian. There were a few that said that they feel most Canadian, but then they would say something like, but I'm ashamed to admit this, but I think I'm more Canadian than I'm Greek. So that was another thing that puzzled us a little bit. And when we looked through the literature and we looked at the interviews more closely, what we found is that they, it might seem surprising, maybe it's the passage of time smoothing things out, and we asked them, like, how were you welcome to Canada? Like, what was there? And most of them had positive things to say. In some cases, when they had negative things to say, they were talking about other Greek Canadians from the first wave that were not as welcoming to them as they would have liked them to be. And this is not now, though, because Gavaiki in 1974 also found high levels of satisfaction among Greek immigrants in Montreal. So it's not just in 2015; it was also the case in 1974. So we think that the mixed identity is constructed along two different dimensions. On the one hand, there's obviously the love and the sense of belonging that these people have for their place of birth, and a lot of them will talk about their place, like the little village, not Greece in general, but that specific area of Greece. But at the same time, they do feel that Greece let them down in big ways. Number one, that they couldn't survive there when they were young, and they left with very traumatic experiences. And we have stories like 11-year-old boys making the trip across the Atlantic, 2-week trip in the winter weather. I mean, and then had to land in Halifax, get on a train, and travel for 11 hours to be picked up by a cousin or an uncle in Toronto or Montreal. So some of them were actually quite the odyssey. So no matter what happened, in the end, they feel that the role that they think the state should play for them, the Greek state couldn't play, the Canadian state could play. So it's very interesting that you have this very local sense of attachment to Greece, but then this very institutional sense of attachment to Canada. from what we have seen. It'd be interesting to see what people who do Hellenic studies, if anyone has looked at that from a different perspective, to see if they found the same thing or not. Okay, so summary, we have people that immigrated at a young age, and so we're still developing sociolinguistically. They're mostly from the Peloponnese, but several regions are represented. The low levels of education in Greek, so there's no polish in terms of the Greek language for most of them. Most of them work, at least in the beginning, in Greek-speaking environments with much dialect contact, and that linguistic, religious, and cultural maintenance were high priorities. So the question that I want to move on forward from here is, how does this affect their language behavior? And I'm going to try to show you that they're speakers of what we call common modern Greek, which is characterized by a great amount of variation, and this variation comes out in their usage. So what is common modern Greek? Just to set the stage for those of you who might not be familiar, we consider the modern Greek as a vernacular. Really starts around the 13th century Common Era, and it's really has taken shape by the early 1500s. However, it starts with great amount of regional variation, which is common for vernaculars before they get stabilized. But Greece is kind of unique in the fact that the question of what will be the vernacular did not get settled for about 150 years after the Greek state was formed. And that was because there were two sides. One side supported this purist or archaizing Greek that was close to the language of the church, and there was another side that promoted the use of the language of the people. But this was very heterogeneous, as can be also in countries like England and France and so forth. And these, especially after the 1860s, the political aspects of this dispute started building up, and they drove each other to extreme positions, such as that in the 1940s there were demodicists, right, people who were for the vernacular in Greece that wanted to abolish the Greek alphabet because they thought that the Greek alphabet reminded everybody of ancient Greek, so you should get rid of it so that people would adopt the demotic form more easily. And this question was not settled until after the junta fell in 1974. Greece became part of the European Union and got social, political, and economic stability that led them to put this question a bit to rest, because it's not formally settled yet. I mean, we have like standard common Greek, but people still fight and have really strong opinions of, for example, should we use a simplified accent marking system, or should we use a full accent marking system in the use of the language, which goes back to the ancient Greek time. But for example, when right-wing ministers take over the Ministry of Education, they put up surreptitiously signs that have things written with the full markings and so forth. And the Greek language question is still very alive in Greece today. And actually, it was actually brought more to life because of the European economic crisis. So this is sorry, I kind of lost my place here. This is a koine, so a language that comes from the contact of several different people, and this is the contact of internal immigrants in the major urban centers of Greece. It developed around the 1920s and 1930s, when we had sort of really rapid urbanization of Greece, especially after the end of World War I and the failure of the Greek campaign in Asia Minor, which then led to the expulsion of about 1 million refugees from Asia Minor back into Greece. And they all went into mostly the urban centers of Athens, Salonika, and Patra, and other places too, but most of them went there. And that created like the sociolinguistic situations that gave rise to an urban varieties. So I want to give you some examples of what this variation is about. First of all, there's variation between learned forms and truly demotic forms. So, and these are examples that we've taken from our transcriptions. So, for example, we'll find doublets, such as the word tafsi, which in Greek really has a very formal tone. It's the word that you use for the cremation of the dead, but our speakers use it like for more regular types of burning. You'll see more archaic forms or archaic forms like kivernisis instead of kivernisi, or fitite instead of fitites. And you can see that these are very close to one another. They're not fully different, so that's what might cause use of one or the other. But they're very reminiscent of that time and what we see in writings of that time, that people have the vernacular which they learn at home, but then they're also acquiring these archaizing forms. The next aspect of Common Greek is that it contains a lot of Athenian features. Now, Athenian is a bit of an interesting dialect because it is the basis of standard modern Greek, but only as it was developed by the huge influx of speakers from the Peloponnese and Athens after Athens became the capital of Greece. So the actual Athenian dialect, as it has come down through antiquity, is no longer spoken in Athens. It's actually spoken outside of Athens, and it's very, very minor. Mostly we're talking about a development from the Peloponnesian dialect. So here you can see this form with the ev in the plural of these nouns, so paterades instead of pateres. We have an o in the first person plural, so echome instead of echume, and variation in the formation of the imperfective past, so kimondan instead of kimondusa. And again, we see variation between these forms in our speakers as well. But for the most part, we find rural features, which were also part of the reports on Common Greek of the era. So prosthetic a, so achelona instead of chelona, pleronis, an e instead of an e, extension of the pronouns with a vowel, so aftona instead of afton, the deletion of a palatal in a cluster, so magaza instead of magazia. And then we have some interesting formations, for example, to form the past with x instead of s, or ahixe instead of ahise, or to use the formative r instead of us for a certain type of verb, so halaga instead of harusa. And the feature that I'm going to go into a bit more depth in a sec, which is this unaccented syllable augment. So the use of eduleva instead of duleva to form the passive verb to work. But even some bigger differences like iman instead of imun. So lots of variant forms in the use of our speakers. So I would like to close with this example on the unaccented syllable augment, because we have enough data to see the patterns a little bit and see how exactly these the contact has influenced speakers' linguistic behavior. So the syllabic augment was an e prefix in ancient Greek, and so we have here two forms: toxevo, which I shoot with a bow, and toxavon, which would be I used to shoot with a bow, or was shooting with a bow. Over the years, this syllabic augment gets a different role, which has to do with stress placement or accent placement. When it's not stressed, it gets deleted, but when it is stressed, it remains. So in two-syllable verbs, because the plural suffixes are also 2-syllable, you go from 3-syllable past tense formations to 4-syllable past formations. Now, why does this play a role? Is because modern Greek has a rule that says you can only have an accent on a syllable up to the 3rd syllable from the end. So look at what happens here. Pezo, I play, becomes epeza, because it's 1, 2, 3 syllables. But pezame does not get the epsilon because it would have been epezame, right? Because we already have 3 syllables in the formation of the form, and so that 4th syllable would be unaccented, and so it's deleted. But there are still many dialects, well, not many, but several dialects that in the 20th century have kept that unaccented stress. So in Cypriot, in Chiot, in Ionian, and in some varieties in the Peloponnesian dialect, you would get an unaccented e that is maintained. So in here, the third example is interesting from the Ionian dialects because this e is not just the 4th syllable from the end, it's the 5th syllable from the end, and it's still maintained. So instead of becoming like something that depends both on the morphology and the phonology, it's a clear morphological marker. So what we did for this is that we looked at the speech pattern of about 130 speakers that we had in Western Greek. And so for the social linguistic profile, we used only 53 because we had to look at great detail. But when we're looking at linguistic patterns, we can just treat this as a corpus and look for certain patterns much more quickly. So we were able to look at more speakers. So this is based on the speech patterns of 130 some speakers from all these different varieties of Greek. And the way that I'm presenting the data is that we have what we expect based on traditional description of these dialectal or regional varieties. And then I have the number of deletions that we found versus the total numbers of places where there could have been a deletion. And so that gives us the percentage of deletions that we actually get. So this means that, for example, we expect really in Athens 100% deletion, but we find 87%. Okay, well, 87 and 100 is not that different. But for people from Central Greece, smaller number of people, but we were expecting again 100% deletion of the unstressed augment, and we only find 45%. But the main observation is that all of the places where we expected to find the augment used 100%, there it's way below the percentage of what we call categorical use, which in social linguistics is estimated at around 80%. So even the southwestern Aegean, which has the most use of the augment, is at 72%. And in places like Crete and even in the Ionian Islands, it's around 50%. So what we see here is clearly the effect of the standard. And if not of the standard, then the common Greek vernacular, which says that this unstressed augment should not be maintained. However, it is also really interesting that, say, speakers from Macedonia, speakers from Athens, and speakers from Thessaly, where we expect them natively to use the deletion, and the deletion is part of the prestigious form of the language, why don't they use it as much? Why do they have instances in which they use this dialectal syllabic augment pattern? Just a hold on that, and I want to show you a couple of examples that show you that this is not just variation from speaker to speaker, but it's also variation within the same speaker, which in linguistics and social linguistics really shows that pattern is really seeped in very deeply into people's speech behavior. So here we have someone from Kefalonia, an Ionian island. that should only use the augmented form. So eduleva is according to pattern, but then right afterwards, he uses two forms without the augment, okay? And this is exceptional. On the other side of the coin, a speaker of Northern Greek from Karlitsa should only use the deleted pattern, but the first form so the first form is here, effiga, that's fine because it's accented, right? It is stressed, it's effiga. But the next one that he uses, effigame, the A is not stressed and should have been figame. And he himself changes forms when he repeats the verb, right? So this is actually quite remarkable. Why are speakers from Northern Greek who should be always using the deleted pattern, why are they using the less standard dialect pattern? And we believe that the explanation for this is that 40% of second wave immigrants to Canada came from the Peloponnese, and the pattern of the syllabic augment for Peloponnesian speakers is that it had variability. So they must have heard it a lot, and they were in a new type of sociolinguistic situation where it doesn't matter so much. That's what I was trying to bring up when I was looking at the sociolinguistic profile. It doesn't matter so much which place you are from Greece, but that you are Greek. And they were trying to build a community where they wanted to focus on what they shared rather than what separated them as Greeks. And part of doing that is a linguistic convergence. I will use some of your dialectal forms, and you'll use some of my dialectal forms. It happens subconsciously, but it happens in many places. And in fact, if the communities are able to progress in time without influence from another language, as happened here with English in their second generation, these types of areas where different dialects contact have very interesting sociolinguistic effects, because what used to be a regional variation pattern becomes maybe a gender role variation pattern, or it becomes a class identity variation pattern. This has been shown quite remarkably for Australia and for dialects of English in Norwich in Eastern England. And I can talk more about that if you have any questions. So the overall message I'd like to take back from this talk is that not only are we finding out interesting things about the history of Greek immigration to Canada after 1950, not only are we able to see patterns of the dialects that these people were speaking in their native communities, but we're also finding out some very interesting things about this period of the history of modern Greek that really hasn't been recorded in Greece. And our speakers, even though they've been away from Greece for maybe 50 or 60 years, they still remain these little treasure troves of archival material without even knowing it. So that's the end of my talk. We have some questions.
So really, thank you so much for this trip into modern Greek history, modern Greek language, and its transplant to Canada. Before I pass it on to the audience, could use maybe presenter's privilege here and ask a question, because I didn't understand something on the deletion of the North Aegean. Of course, I would go towards Lesbos. You would probably expect that. So it seems that this kind of deletion seems to fit what you were expecting in the case of Lesbos, as opposed to other places. Does it? Or am I wrong?
Let me make sure that. Sorry.
So North Aegean.
Yeah, North Aegean. Yes, they're one of the places where we find 91% of using the deletion, and that is according to pattern.
So does this mean that basically you still have a population that sticks to more traditional kind of usages as they would have been expected at the place of origin? Is that the idea? Or am I reading
Yeah,
this?
well, no, it's a very, very interesting question. Something that we would like to go into a bit in more detail as we gather up more data. And I think you'll agree to this, and maybe others in the audience know this. There are certain dialect areas in Greece that are, more proud of their dialect than other areas because of the prestige that they have. I mean, the Ionian Islands is a big case in point because they're like, oh, yes, we speak more like Italians because we were part of the West, and everybody else was, occupied by the Turks, so we're much more advanced, and so there's that. Crete as well, they're ferociously proud of their dialect. On the other hand, in the central parts of Greece, and again, I think this is no surprising, but there's more linguistic insecurity about their ways of speaking because there's more stigma, right? Like when you think of all the dialect features that get stigmatized in Greek popular culture, where do they come from? They don't really come from Crete or the Ionian Islands. They mostly come from the northeast part of the Peloponnese, the western part of Greece, and then the mountainous regions of Greece. So there's, and I think that this has passed on to these speakers as well. So some speakers are more willing to accommodate if they're less secure in their dialect speaking.
To me, what's fascinating is the variation between, let's say, North Aegean and, let's say, Thessaly, because you expect some similarities there on the basis of what the dialects actually sound like, and yet the outcomes once you find yourself in Canada seem to be distinct.
No, that's a very astute observation, and like I said, I mean, there is no question that the region of Thessaly is one of the regions that suffers the most about dialect stigmatization.
So I'll, in anticipation of any questions from the audience here, I'll go to one of the questions that we have open from Andrew Cheng. I would love to hear more about the socio-indexical value of the augment among Greek Canadians. Did any of them ever comment about its use by certain demographics or stereotypes of speakers? Perhaps some of them associate one variant or the other with worse Greek of second generation Greek Canadians.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, obviously, Andrew knows the social linguistics really well. That's an aspect that we haven't looked into yet. And because this is like a morphological variable, we have a lot of data about it, but it's not as much as we would if it was a purely phonological variable. So one of the last questions that we had in our interviews, we asked the speakers to talk about the dialect specifically. We haven't looked at that data in much detail, but I would have to say that most of the answers were about lexical issues. We didn't have any responses that were about, features that are below consciousness, really. In fact, one of the really interesting aspects of this data set is that because it comes from the 1950s, where it was a bit, a free-for-all in terms of dialect features, we find a lot of non-self-conscious usage of dialect features that have been really stigmatized after the 1980s in Greece. I've given a couple of talks about that, and I'm happy to share those aspects of that with you, Andrew, if you're interested. But I don't say it's not something that we've been able to have enough data in order to look at the indexable value. Okay, I'm glad I answered the question.
There's a second question from Andrew, and here again, in anticipation of anything else. From a phonetic perspective, I'm also interested to know whether the augment occurs in certain parts of IPs. I wonder if it could ever be confused for a schwa-like discourse particle, like in Spanish during the analysis.
I mean, the simple answer to that is that I don't know, but I've definitely not seen it discussed like that in any of the. You know, I mean, the thing about it is that this feature is not really common in Greek anymore. It's really hard to find. So before our finding of these speakers in Canada, the best descriptions that we had of the use of this feature were from things that were written in the 1920s and 1930s. So it's not so so prevalent that we can go and check these things out with speakers that use it in Greece. So, and then, I mean, for us to look at something like that in our data, we would also have to take into account that, okay, these speakers speak Greek, but they do show influence from English, right? So even if they have schwa, how do we know that it's not from the use of schwa in English, right? So that's something that complicates the
Should we hear with German that Luther's Bible and his German important translation into a vernacular was very important for stabilizing the German language. You raised the issue of Orthodox faith several times. Does the reading or I imagine it's mostly a translation into a Demotic Greek that's read in church, or no? It's
for example, my grandmother knew about 100 sayings and hymns in church Greek. Didn't understand a single word. It was remarkable. To this day, and one of the biggest people will say something from church and they think it's completely different thing. And it actually does. It's quite funny. I don't know. It's a little
but it's been translated since. I mean,
no, I mean it has, but it hasn't. I don't know if you understand. It's like, okay, because I mean, just think about it. Luther's was Protestant, right? The Greek church is the Greek church. It hasn't changed the way that it talks since what do you say?
Since the beginning.
Yes.
Since
Well,
the Bible.
there were some changes that happened naturally around, until like the 6th or 7th century, in the Common Era, and then they started really to formalize the language, right?
Yeah. But again, I mean, what you described about your mother is actually an accurate depiction of what you actually have in churches. Churches go for Easter. People in villages will go for Easter, and all the women in the village of a certain age will know every single chant and would recite it, but they don't necessarily understand what that means. And it's up to the priest, assuming that the priest himself is educated, to provide exegesis in the context of mass. But
so the Greek liturgy, there's not a single word that is spoken in vernacular Greek. It's all spoken in church Greek. And there's only very few moments in which you can use your language of standard Greek in order to understand what is actually being said. Everything else because you've been told what to do when these words are heard.
but certainly the augment, for instance, is there.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
But we don't know that. Yeah.
But no, if no one's understanding it anyway, then. But so these second generation kids that are sent to Greek school.
Back in the 70s.
Which is at the church.
Yes.
The biblical stuff is not a vehicle for any of that.
It is and it isn't. Again, there's this clash there, right? Because the church wants to do the archaism language, but most of the people who have come over are leftists, and they really see the church as like a big pillar of their identity. But at the same time, they have more socially progressive views. And in several Greek communities, there have been splits between the more secular part of the community and the more religious part of the community. The more religious part of the community will have stronger ties to the first wave of immigration, whereas the more secular will be more aligned to the people that came after the junta, because the church was seen as complicit with the dictatorship and so forth, right? So it is like immensely to this day, Edmonton is split. There's two Greek communities, one that's pro-church and one that's not so pro-church. And these things were not just accidental. Parties in Greece and the church organization in general, they fomented some of this separation. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but it is not a simple question to answer. It depends on the school, it depends on the community, it depends on who the teachers were. Like, for example, there were places where the teachers were old school teachers, and they preferred to do, all the greeting marks and all the funny accents from ancient Greek and use more archaism forms and stuff like that. There were communities where they would have liked to have those kinds of teachers, but they couldn't. So it just took, the young leftist teacher who had just come over and said, okay, you teach, and that person then could really have a more vernacular agenda. As what happened with Hellenic studies and the establishment of Hellenic studies, we should talk about this as well in the 90s and so forth. Then and I think especially in Montreal and Toronto, but also here, then and of course in Germany and all those places, the ministry starts sending out teachers into the community that are licensed to teach in Greece to help with the teaching of Greek in the communities. It brings books, textbooks, and materials. Now, of course, they're available online. It organizes exams where kids of the second or third generation can sit and write these exams and then get certificates of Grecophony for if they want to go back to Greece and teach there or work as a civil servant or something like that. So as the communities get more established in Canada and there's more money in the Greek state, there is more standardization. But the first decade or 15 years, they just try to do the best that they can. And from a linguistic perspective, that's great for us because the absence of that standardizing influence means that, 1,000 flowers can bloom and we can find all these different varieties. Otherwise, the dialect would have been quashed in Canada as well, or in another. Yes.
That's a pretty good segue into my question, actually. Yeah. I'm super interested in how slang and sort of subsets of dialect develop in immigrant communities. When you were doing the research on this project and interviewing all these people, did you encounter any sort of interesting verbal quirks? Or any sort of slang language?
Yes, but of course it is this slang language of their youth.
Oh.
Right, so we get slang language of Greece in the 50s and then 60s.
And I'm imagining that's not really used in Greece anymore, but it continues here.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm sure that in Greece it's used a little bit by older people as well. But the difference is that the older people in Greece are constantly told by their kids and grandkids how uncool they are when they're using their slang terms, whereas the younger kids in Canada, they have slang language in English, and then in Greek they don't have that normalizing effect. And God knows, my kids have forbidden me from saying certain words that reflect the slang language of my youth. But when it comes to Greek, they don't know. They're not able to change my behavior.
So would you say that some of these linguistic trends are better preserved over here than they are in Greece?
Well, look, when it comes with the slang language, its main characteristic is that it's ephemeral.
Right.
Very few forms survive. Here in Canada, I would say that it hasn't been abandoned as easily as it would have if these same speakers were in Greece.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the question.
So I'll throw in a question from Domingo, which connects us again with the augment. Isn't retaining the augment a Katharevousa element, or does the Katharevousa drop the augment too? I ask because it seems strange that the more classical form is less prestigious.
Yeah. Well, the Katharevousa has developed so many forms over its 130 years of existence, 230 years of existence. It's really hard to say what what Katharevousa are you talking about? So the really purest forms of Katharevousa that you really had to speak like Socrates in order for you to be accepted, let's say, or and then there were lesser forms of Katharevousa which would be more fossilized and focus on certain like very big and obvious aspects of the Attic grammar, and the augment would be one of them. So yes, it is interesting that despite the fact that the church languages, as David said, would have the augment present, and it's one of those things that for example, the sermon that was written by the bishop or something like that would have many forms of the augment. I can only imagine that there is a very clear domain separation in the speaker's mind, right? So there's the church language, and speakers are like, well, that's the way the church speaks. It's important to us, but it has nothing to do with how we speak with one another. Now, a huge part of this, again, is a matter of education. The more educated a speaker was when they left Greece, the more of the Katharevousa forms they would know, and so would be more familiar with the retention of the augment. But again, I remember that most of these speakers had barely finished elementary school, so their exposure to that kind of formal language training, because that's what Katharevousa was, right? I mean, Katharevousa was a supplementary language that you were taught in school. And one of the big differences in the Greek education system from like 1920 onwards was at what point was the Katharevousa taught in school? So if the government was really conservative, it started at first grade when you were 6 years old. But if the government was not so conservative, then it was, when you were 12 years old or when you were 15 years old, right? So, funnily enough, similar things still happen in Greece. Like, when did we start teaching ancient Greek? Well, when the government is conservative, it starts when you're 12 years old. And when the government is, more left-leaning, it starts when you're 15 years old. And you get so many hours versus so many hours. So I think that's the main answer here, that the use of these more archaizing forms in the church language could only affect the people who could understand the church language to some extent to begin with. And most of our speakers will not have been able to parse the linguistic forms that they were being exposed to.
I find really interesting the constant weaving of the socio-political and practical political in this discussion with ultimately about language, and especially when earlier on you were talking about the kind of 70s, 80s Greek state dispatch of teachers. And I mean, for an outsider, this can seem okay, the Greek state sends teachers, that's just education. But these teachers also come with state infrastructure, with state aspirations, and the same people who receive teachers also receive the possibility of flying home to vote in the elections with a PASOK voting thing or a Nea Demokratia voting ballot.
And they can fundraise.
And they can fundraise, exactly. So you have these languages not by itself, it always exists within this intensely political realm. Interestingly enough, with a crisis, you have this situation where the state has to completely retreat because there's no money to send teachers. And now you have perhaps some sort of new generation of immigrants. But for Canada, it seems that those numbers are still relatively limited. So.
Yeah. No, they're limited, and they don't congregate. Like in my experience, this is just anecdotal, but they don't seek out the Greek community like the new immigrants. And for the reasons they speak the language, they already know what they're doing. Most of them are older and established, right? They talk about brain drain. You got masters and PhD holders leaving the country, not unskilled laborers.
One final little thing, I noticed that the people arriving in Vancouver are slightly older. I mean, that's almost 2-3 years older than the people arriving in the rest of Canada.
You mean in my
Yeah, in the data, yeah. And do you have any explanation? I mean, my immediate thing is maybe they're not your classic immigrant, there's ship jumpers, and maybe you need to be older to be on a ship working as a sailor, and maybe you jump later, but I don't know. I mean, do you have any idea?
I think it's actually because most of them had tried a stop somewhere else beforehand, like Germany or Belgium or something like that before coming to Canada.
It's really so interesting. I mean,
yeah, no, thank you for the many questions. I really appreciate it. I want to show you what I have here as a bonus, an unexpected result from our database. And this has to do with the work that Lawrence has done and helped me do. So in linguistics over the past 10 years, people have been able to create all these wonderful automated tools that help us do a lot of our linguistics work. So in Canada, there's this thing called the Montreal Forced Aligner, which basically, if you give the platform enough information, it can, what we call, phonetically segment the speech signal for you, which is something that takes a tremendous amount of work for humans to do. And even though it might do it only with a 75% or 80% accuracy, you can then kind of check and know where their inaccuracies are, and so be very targeted in how you do it. And having this large database and the money that was given to us from Shirk and from the Niarchos Foundation allowed us to create, again with Lawrence's work, a plugin that will do this segmentation for Greek. So just to show you what I mean, this is a picture of an analysis of the visual signal. So here we have the phrase "ne meta katevika στην Athena," and usually, what we try to do is break it down into words, and then to take each word and break it down into the sounds. And that would allow us then to say, okay, this is how they pronounce the A, or this is how they pronounce the K, and so forth. What Lawrence's work has allowed us to do is to go from the phrase to the word and then the sound automatically with around 75% accuracy. So the first work is done by our transcribers and annotators, and it takes them about 8 hours to do 20 minutes. And you'd be like, oh my God, that's a hell of a lot of time. Well, it would have taken like 24 hours to do those 20 minutes with the level of detail that I will show you next. We're able to upload the files on a server, just let the server run for a few days, and then afterwards, we get this. Right, so you can see that it's taken the phrase, the one place where the phrase is made up of 2 words, it cuts it into the 2 individual words, and then it takes each word and guesstimates where the specific vowel or consonant is. And it's a thing that I'm the most excited about, because it's something that keep working on it and making it even more accurate. It will help Greek linguists in the future a lot, because right now, if somebody's working on an English data sound file and they have the transcription or something, they can annotate that transcription, like I said, in a couple of days of a mainframe server working at it. And somebody working in Greece will need months, if not years, to accomplish the same amount of linguistic information extraction. We get this to work, we'll be able to get the interest and the ability of people to work on their Greek data at the same level that English speakers, French speakers, and German speakers can do. So we're really, really excited about this. And thank you all for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for this really, really, really interesting and stimulating talk. I want to thank our audience, both in this room, in this first day of being able to see one another's face. It seems both weird and wonderful at the same time, and our audience online for being with us. Just some announcements before before we call it a day. Next week, you can join us same time, Friday the 18th, for a talk by Elizabeth de Palma from UC Santa Barbara. The title of the talk is Securing Paul in Gaul, the donation of Constantine. We hope to see you again in the coming week, and wish you a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.